It is Thursday, February 24th, and welcome to the State of Purple. Today on the show, the coaching staff is in place, and we're taking a point of the season, the offseason that is, where trade rumors are swirling wildly. Let's take a look at some of the more interesting ones for the Minnesota Vikings on today's State of Purple podcast with Aj Mansour and Jack, presented by Pilot Games.
Seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side. Off by Diggs. Stay up. Oh my God. 30. No. 10. Touchdown. Are you kidding me? Miracle finish. It's a Minneapolis miracle. Oh my God. No way. What a miracle finish!
Hey, everybody, and welcome to the State of Purple podcast. He's Jack Day. I'm Aj Mansour. This is the State of Purple, KFAN's weekly Minnesota Vikings podcast. Glad you could join us for today's live stream recording. If you're watching on the live stream, I encourage you to play along. Put some comments in the comment section. Let us know what you're thinking about today's topic, about the Minnesota Vikings, about new head coach Kevin O'Connell, about Jack's backwards hat. Tell me what you think. Anything and everything can be part of the show today. It is an interactive live recording on KFAN's social media network, and then you can listen back to it on the podcast channel as well. Jack Day, how you doing, my man?
I'm doing well. It's been an exciting week. I think we can finally – last week, see Vikings fans could finally exhale that their head coach is here and none of the nonsense about the potential waffling back and forth with the Rams situation and Sean McVay. It was a great press conference, I think. I think both Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell hit their press conferences out of the park. I think that's a good step in the right direction. There's still a lot left to be proven, obviously, but I think both press conferences went very well, and the word collaboration has been brought up not only in their press conferences, but all three press conferences with the coordinators today. So that is, if it wasn't obvious after the first Mark Wolf press conference, collaboration is going to be key for this team moving forward.
Yeah, you as you alluded to, you were at the Kevin O'Connell press conference last week. You watched the press conferences today with some of the assistants. What stood out to you? It seemed from afar, I was watching online, that he seems very poised. He was on with Barrero after that. You can get that podcast at KFAN.com. Handles himself very well. So we've got two guys in Kwesi Adofo-Mensah and Kevin O'Connell as the head coach and the general manager that can handle themselves in front of a microphone, in front of a camera, and do represent this organization in a great way. Now, their success will not be judged on how they talk in front of a camera. It will be judged on whether this football team finds success or not. But what stood out for you from being at the press conference last week? First, let's start with the Kevin O'Connell press conference. What stood out to you there?
Yeah, I think the big one was probably the biggest question that was asked too, was just revolving around Kirk Cousins. And I think it seems as if Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, their plans moving forward right now are revolving around quarterback Kirk Cousins, but he's using lingo that isn't exactly saying, you know what, I'm sticking my neck out right now and saying Kirk Cousins is going to be the quarterback. He's saying I'm anticipating that Kirk Cousins is going to be the quarterback. And I don't think a head coach can necessarily, I don't think you'd want him to say it any other way, obviously, because there could be changes regardless of if Kirk Cousins is going to be the quarterback moving forward. Currently, that could change in a week. We know this covering the NFL, obviously, but some of the quotes that he said, I will say this first. If you want to get like a full deep dive, I think I have like a 1,200 word article up on KFAN.com where it's a ton of quotes and just kind of giving some of my thoughts on how the press conference went. One thing that I have written down, you win with your people. And that just stems kind of from the collaboration and kind of this working togetherness. And that was a huge talking point throughout his press conference. But it was interesting. I think he did confirm that he is going to be calling the plays. That was kind of something that no one was 100% sure on. I think we were kind of speculating that that was going to be the case. And now a week later, exactly a week later, he has his coaching staff in place with Wes Phillips, the offensive coordinator, Ed Donatel, defensive coordinator, and Matt Daniels, the special teams coordinator. It's a younger staff, the experience on the defensive side. They did confirm, and they confirmed again today, that they're going to be making a switch more towards a 3-4 base style defense. But Donatel alluded to today that it's going to be a little bit of mix and match. There's going to be some 4-3 fronts. There's going to be some 3-4 fronts as well. And that was another talking point that was something pretty common that you and I have talked about. And they confirmed today that Danielle Hunter is going to be looked at as more of an outside linebacker / defensive end. He's no longer just a defensive end. But that's kind of a little bit of just recapping from my memory. Like I said, go to KFAN.com under the Vikings blog. You can get the full rundown on the press conference from a week ago.
And then the press conferences today, Jack. The staff, for all intents and purposes, is in place. There may be some analysts and specialists that are still added along the way, but real quick, I'm going to go over the staff. You mentioned some of them. Clearly, Kevin O'Connell, the head coach. Mike Pettin, an interesting hire as an assistant head coach. I think that's an interesting thing to note when you have a guy who has a little experience with the Browns being a head coach. He's been a defensive coordinator. He's been around the league, a little bit older, but he can be an assistant head coach, an ear for Kevin O'Connell, and a voice for Kevin O'Connell to speak to him and maybe mentor him in this new role. That's something that didn't exist before. You have Ed Donatel, the defensive coordinator, Wes Phillips, the offensive coordinator. Jack, one thing, because these hires came in two different waves. You had the first wave, which didn't include an offensive coordinator, was kind of an interesting thing. We weren't sure exactly what the plan was at that moment. This was last week. We knew that O'Connell was going to call the plays, but we weren't sure exactly what that meant as far as would there be an offensive coordinator, or was he kind of the offensive coordinator? Now we know. Wes Phillips, you recognize the name. His dad, Wade, obviously well-known in NFL circles. Matt Daniels, special teams coordinator. Brian Angelicio, tight ends coach and passing game coordinator. Jared Johnson, assistant quarterbacks coach. Durante Jones, defensive backs coach. Ben Kotwicka, assistant special teams coach. That's an interesting one too, an assistant special teams coach. Not something that we've had in the past before. Maybe there's a specialty that he brings to the table with him. Chris Cupper, offensive line coach. Curtis Modkins, running backs coach, run game coordinator. You have Chris O'Hara, the quarterbacks coach. Justin Rascati, the assistant offensive line coach, another assistant there. Chris Rumpf, the defensive line coach. Mike Smith, outside linebackers coach and pass rush specialist. That'll be an interesting one too, Jack, with that potential for the 3-4 switch. Anything stand out to you? I mentioned a couple things. Sorry if I stepped in your touchdown call, but anything from that list stand out to you as an interesting choice, an interesting position, or an interesting name?
Mike Pettin was one, and that was brought up in the press conference last week as well. Just Kevin O'Connell was talking about having someone that has that experience that he can lean on. I think we had mentioned that a couple of times in previous episodes, where not only, I think if you were going to go in the direction of hiring a younger offensive-minded head coach, getting a older, kind of more proven defensive coordinator, which they have in Ed Donatel, and someone else that he can kind of rely on. I know Mike Pettin, he doesn't have the greatest track record. That shouldn't be looked at as importance, in my opinion, because he's here as a resource for Kevin O'Connell. Kevin O'Connell is going to be scripting this offense and kind of calling the plays like he confirmed last week. Mike Pettin, just another guy that he can lean on. I like that he was able to go out and get someone with the experience. And then Mike Smith, the outside linebackers coach. This isn't really anything from a Vikings perspective, but when he left Green Bay, Zadarius Smith just tweeted the eye emojis. And we love speculation on this show. If you watch the show, you already know that. And then when he signed with the Vikings, or when the Vikings brought him on, he tweeted the eye emojis again. Zadarius Smith is a huge free agent name this free agent class to monitor. I don't know if he's going to be going back to Green Bay. They have some other obvious glaring situations with Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams. But Zadarius Smith has been a very good pass rusher in that Packers scheme. And I don't know if him coming to Minnesota could lure him over here. Obviously, the Vikings still need help at that position, whether it's outside linebacker, defensive end, like you alluded to with Danielle Hunter earlier today. But getting a better pass rush would make all three phases of this defense better. And right now, I'm not super confident going into the year with what's on this roster. Obviously, Danielle Hunter is the big one, but there's some contract issues that we'll probably get to a little bit later. But that's another name that kind of just piqued my ears up a little bit because of the Zadarius Smith stuff, because he has been such a good pass rusher for the Green Bay Packers, and he's been able to create some havoc for the Vikings over the last couple seasons.
Yeah, Brandon Herrera brings up a good point in the chat. He says, why so many assistant coaches? I think it's an interesting thing. And I would have to assume when you have a young coach, you're bringing in and, tapping into all of your network and bringing in people that you can speak to and can influence you and your head coaching abilities. But I also would have to think that some of these assistant coaches, there's an assistant quarterbacks coach, an assistant special teams coach, another assistant coach, assistant head coach. Everybody brings a little bit of a different specialty to the table. And I'd like to think that, if that a quarterbacks coach has, for example, if the quarterbacks coach is a traditional stand-up in the pocket quarterbacks coach, maybe that assistant coach is an assistant coach that has some sort of an experience either coaching or actually being maybe a mobile quarterback. Those are the sorts of things that you're talking about. We've talked for a long time about bringing an assistant special teams coach that might be more of a kicking specialist rather than a player manager. That's what special teams coaches usually are. They're player managers. They know the schemes, they know the layouts. But when it comes to the specialty of kicking or punting, sometimes there's been talk, especially in Minnesota, given the history of this team, to get a guy who's actually been a kicker. Those are the kinds of ideas that you bring to the table with the assistant coaches. I'm jumping out on a limb here because I don't know that to be the case, but I'd have to imagine that each of them brings something special to the table. But what it tells me is that the organization is willing to hire people, anybody and everybody needed to make this the best roster of coaches, the best team of coaches that can get these players going and hopefully push this team into the right direction. Am I wrong with anything I just said, Jack?
I don't think so. And just going back to the word collaboration, it's just being able to bounce ideas off of one another. I think the more coaches, the merrier in this case, especially that Matt Daniels is 32 years old and he just took over a special teams coordinator role. That's a very young age to take over what is Vikings fans should be all familiar with, a pretty important phase of the game of football. So I like it. I think it does have to do with it just being kind of a youth movement. Obviously, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah is 40. I think Kevin O'Connell is 36. Special teams coordinator is 32. That there is a youth movement in Minnesota, and having as many bodies within that building that have the knowledge to kind of bounce ideas off, I think it's a great resource for these younger coaches.
Andy brings up in the chat another good question. Where is the kicking coach and game theory coach? Not sure about the kicking coach, but I have an interesting thought on the game theory coach. The game theory coach was a proposition that Corey Cove brought to the table, that a lot of people brought to the table because Mike Zimmer wasn't good at game theory. Kevin O'Connell brings with him an interesting experience with game theory, having been a coach with the LA Rams under Sean McVay, maybe more of an aggressive game theory, a different approach to this table. The entire staff, I named 10 to 15 people. They all did bring different experiences there. Game theory coach is something that maybe the last regime needed that maybe this one doesn't, I guess is the point I'm getting at. We don't know, and maybe they do, and maybe it would be a specialist that they can bring in and it would be a benefit for this team. But until we actually see them on the football field and see what they're good at and what they're not good at, let's give them a moment and say, hey, maybe somebody who's on this roster is able to handle game theory or influence the coach or whatever that looks like. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and think maybe that they're already on this roster. They just don't have the title of a game, or what was it? I'm a game theory coach, right? That's just my thought on that. I might be wrong. Who knows? They might hire him tomorrow. They might have hired him during this show already starting. I don't know. But let's just pump the brakes a little bit. They got 10 new bodies in there that they can have to bring different things to the table. So we'll see that there. Jack, push the coaching staff to the side. Okay. We are at the point in the offseason now, specifically for the Minnesota Vikings, where you have your general manager, you have your coach, you now turn your attention to personnel and you start talking about what that draft looks like. You start talking about what free agency looks like. We've already done that on this podcast. And you start to look at what this roster looks like. And specifically for the Minnesota Vikings, it is how is this roster going to turn over from one regime to the other, whether it's the 3-4 defense or whether it's the new offensive style. More specifically, how is this roster going to handle, or how is this regime going to handle, or what do we need to do to get the salary cap in order? that is where you get a lot of wild ideas and a lot of speculation surrounding players who could potentially be traded, players who could potentially be cut, and just roster moves that could be made. And Jack, you have mentioned multiple times that this roster and some familiar names that have been here for a long time, that are Vikings favorites, that we all have a jersey of in our house somewhere, might not be on this roster. I'm going to throw out a couple of the rumors that are out there, and they include a couple of those names. Now, let's start with the obvious one, Kirk Cousins. I've got 8 comments in the chat already about trading Kirk Cousins, getting that salary off the books, whatever. That should be priority number one. The idea that the Carolina Panthers made a phone call to the Minnesota Vikings inquiring about Kirk Cousins came up this last week because a report was out there that said that they did. They made a phone call. Sounds like it didn't go very far so far, but at this point, is Matt Rule, is that his name, the coach in Green Bay, or Green Bay, in Carolina? He has a win now mentality, right? He had a down year. He was able to stay for another year, but this might be a win now scenario, and Kirk Cousins might be a win now quarterback. First off, any thoughts on that fit? And then secondly, I know that the compensation that they have, there isn't a ton of it. I think they have a first-round pick, 6th overall, no second, no third this year, and then you're looking to future assets there. Does any of that interest you?
It piques my interest, and I think it should pique the interest of most people that follow this team. But I will say I do think Matt Rule is in win-now mode. If they have another down season, they already swung and missed on Sam Darnold. I think you and I are both willing to say this because we're kind of in the middle of the spectrum more than the majority, I will say. Kirk Cousins is a far much better quarterback than what Sam Darnold is. Kirk Cousins would instantly make the Carolina Panthers a better football team. And I think one of the trade proposals that I saw was sending Kirk Cousins to Carolina, and they ate $35 million. The Vikings couldn't get out of the $10 million. And they got in return the 6th overall pick this year and a second rounder in next year's draft class. If the Vikings get that phone call and don't end up hitting the accept button, I think we should walk up to TCO Performance Center and have a word with the new GM already. But I did a mock draft yesterday where I essentially
of course you did
got that, where it was like I had the 6th overall pick and the 12th overall pick, and the Vikings were looking at this as, I don't necessarily know if Kayvon Thibodeau is going to drop to the 6th overall pick, but he's a monster of a pass rusher for the Oregon, coming out of Oregon. And I was able to draft him and a cornerback. I think it just, with the holes on that defensive side of the ball that we've talked about regularly on this show already, it would give the Vikings a lot more resources. It would give them another high-end pick in next year's class, or next year's draft in the 2nd round. And next year's class is the class where I think you can dip in and kind of hopefully land your quarterback of the future, or at least try to get your quarterback of the future. Next year's draft class is a lot stronger class for the quarterback position. So if you want to be a GM and head coach, I said this on another show that I was a guest on this week, you can build up the defense and have it. It doesn't necessarily matter who the quarterback would be going into the season. Build up that defense. And we talk about this. I know this kind of divides the fan base, this bridge term, the bridge quarterback, but bring in someone like a Marcus Mariota or a Gardner Minshew, rebuild that defense up with a ton of young talent, and then draft a guy in next year's class that you hope is your quarterback of the future. This would be an exciting regime to follow over the next couple of years. And this is what I mentioned. I don't think Kevin O'Connell and Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah, they could do whatever they want this year and their jobs are going to be safe. They could go 0-17. And I don't think there's any way that you're going to fire a first-time head coach just 1 year after one season as a head coach. So I think the Vikings should at least consider it. I also see the side of the spectrum where I don't necessarily buy into, at least at this very moment, the Carolina Panthers having any interest in sending that 6th overall selection, because that's a lot of draft real estate, and they don't have a lot other than that pick. So I don't know if that's necessarily realistic. I think it was a PFF article that I saw that mentioned on, but if that was a trade that was offered to the Vikings, I'd have a hard time thinking they would deny something where they were getting a 1st and a 2nd round pick out of Kirk Cousins and getting out of the majority of his contract.
Well, and that's the key. You know, at the end of the day, this regime needs to decide whether they're going to go long-term with Kirk Cousins or not. If you're not, you get what you can get for him this year, and you just take the 2022 season for what it is and start building, whether that's draft picks, whether that's money that you can get back in free agency and use to develop that defense or that offense. You mentioned a couple names for quarterback spot. There was a weird report that actually came from the Common Man. So Sometimes those reports are fishing, and sometimes they're goofing around. This one seemed like it was legit that Ryan Fitzpatrick was a name that the Minnesota Vikings might look at as far as just a Band-Aid quarterback for one season if Kirk isn't there. That's an okay option, right? I know that it doesn't. No fan likes the prospects of thinking, okay, we're giving up on the season. Like, we're not looking forward to it. There's thoughts about what that will, how Dalvin and Justin Jefferson and Thielen will feel about those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, Kwesi Adolfo-Mensa needs to make the decision for the long-term benefit of this organization. And if it is getting out from under that contract, starting the rebuild, whatever that looks like, whether it's a full rebuild or a partial rebuild, but you start it right now. You can have some opportunities through trade. You can have some opportunities through the draft. Vikings fans have this just overwhelming fear about what that means for the quarterback of the future because they have not drafted quarterbacks well in the past. This is a whole new ballgame. That's not to say that O'Connell and Adolfo-Mensa know exactly what they're doing when it comes to drafting quarterbacks or are guaranteed to hit a home run, but you can't take the faults and the failures of Rick Spielman and put that on anybody who's with the organization right now. You just can't. That doesn't have anything to do with them. So if they opt to do these sorts of things, you got to put our faith in them and think that, hey, what they're telling us is not necessarily that they know the answer, but that Kirk Cousins is not the future. That's what they're telling us. So you get out from that money, you start turning the page right away, and then you start moving forward. That's what that is there. We're going to get a lot of Kirk Cousins rumors. There are a couple other teams, too, that would be a good fit. You have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Pittsburgh Steelers, teams that are good fits. We've already heard the rumors that they're just a quarterback away. And Kirk Cousins is maybe that quarterback for many of those teams. If they can afford even the 35 of that contract, whatever it might end up being, you look at all those offers, and if they're not going to extend him, you trade him. It's either you extend him for 2 or 3 years into the future, and he is your guy that you're tying your wagons to, or you cut ties now and get what you can get for him. If you let this contract play out for one season, you're wasting one season. You're not able to bring free agents in with that money. You're not able to get anything as far as compensation in the draft or a bonus for a trade. You're just completely wasting the 2020 season. It's less of a waste if they lose every game in the 2022 season without Kirk Cousins and get draft picks than it is if they keep Kirk Cousins, let him walk at the end of the season, and waste the free agency period and the draft period of this season without the benefit of that trade.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And for the people that are in that boat where it's like, well, what happens in 2022? Maybe they do draft a quarterback. Maybe they don't. Maybe they figure out what they have in Kellen Mond. Maybe Kellen Mond was
not it though. I mean, I know you're just saying that, but I think that at this point Mike Zimmer is who Mike Zimmer is, but the fact that he didn't get a sniff and didn't get an opportunity when there were injuries and when there were opportunities to start, they would rather, find other guys that have no future with this team to see what they have or to see if they can win the game. That kind of tells you a lot about what Kellen Mond was bringing to the table. I don't know. I think that the Mond ship has sailed too, personally.
Yeah, and that's fair. But like you said, we can't look at this as, hey, look at what Rick Spielman did at the quarterback position. The only real, and this might have been even prior to Rick actually taking over the GM role, only real, Teddy Bridgewater, I think, was selected 32nd overall, where they traded back in the first round to draft him. But the only real one in recent memory, other than Teddy, was Christian Ponder, and obviously that was a bust. Do you want us to not draft a wide receiver because of Laquan Treadwell? Look how that turned out. They went out and they traded their best wide receiver, and they drafted Justin Jefferson, and it worked out. They need to have less fear of swinging and missing, and they need to go out and do it, and they need to find somebody that is going to be a game changer for this team if they don't think Kirk Cousins is that guy. And maybe all the stuff that they're saying, maybe Kirk Cousins is the guy, and this is all just fun speculation, because as you and I have alluded to, I think he fits anywhere from the 8th best quarterback in the league to 12 or 13, somewhere in there, depending on the Sunday that he's playing, obviously. So there's a lot that's going to unfold over the upcoming weeks and months. And right now there's just so much uncertainty around that position. And I think that stems from the $45 million cap hit that was created because of the previous GM and head coach.
You mentioned Christian Ponder. I'd like to wish a very happy birthday to him tomorrow. Actually, that's some random thing that popped up in my phone from back in the day. So happy birthday, Christian Ponder, tomorrow. Jack, another potential trade opportunity. This one came, where did this one come from? Let me pull it up here real quick. This was a Pro Football Focus article as well. I think they went through all the teams in the league and said, okay, who could use a breath of fresh air? Who could be available for trade? Who could, maybe use a new environment that could benefit them in the 2022 season? It's a name that we've already mentioned today, and it was discussed on the Power Trip Morning Show as well today. There's an interesting tidbit I'm going to bring up there, but Danielle Hunter was the name that they brought up that could maybe use a fresh start out of Minnesota, move on. They didn't have a whole lot of value for him as far as a trade goes. I think they said that it would be a second round. This is the estimation, a second rounder and a fourth rounder to the Minnesota Vikings for Danielle Hunter, who's only 27 years old. Injury situation. We have his inability to get on the field, but we still remember that he was one of the fastest player in the NFL to 50 sacks at some point in the season. Big contract, $18 million bonus, I think, on March 20th. You could clear something like $14 million if you got him off the books. These are all factors that go into that. What do you think about moving Danielle Hunter, Jack?
I would be on board with moving Danielle Hunter for the right price, and I don't know if that is the correct price, in my opinion. I know there's a little bit of a gray area there because Danielle Hunter, because of the injuries over the last 2 seasons. But if you lose Danielle Hunter on that defense and you don't get any valuable picks in this draft class, I don't know who's going to be rushing the passer for the Vikings in 2022. And Danielle Hunter, like you said, when he's healthy, prior to the last 2 seasons, I don't think there were really ever any injury concerns with Danielle Hunter. I know the neck injury, kind of the lingeringness of that 2 years ago was kind of worrisome, but when he was on the field, even in 2021, which I think it was only 7 or 8 games, it was very, very clear that he was still a difference maker for this team and by far the best pass rusher on this roster. So I don't know if shipping him out for I think it was a 4th this year and a 2nd next year is what you said. Yep. I don't know if that's the right price tag when, especially like you said, he is only 27 years old. I think that can be argued to be a top 3 most important position on the field outside of quarterback and maybe left tackle. And that defense losing their superstar pass rusher, I know they went through half the season last year without it, but it's just such a different style of a defense. And it does get interesting because of the conversation that we've had about what Ben Lieber mentioned. I think this was probably last year that we were talking about this. If he does go to that more of an outside linebacker role, I don't see Danielle Hunter flourishing in coverage by any means. And I don't know if he's going to be a superstar from a 2-point stance. That was something that Lieber said. He gets his leverage from being down in that 3-point stance. And I don't know. It's a little bit of a gray area, like I said, but at the end of the day, I would want more for Danielle Hunter. But if it is going towards the direction of more of a full rebuild, I think he's certainly a name that's worth monitoring.
I'm glad you brought the Ben Lieber point up. He 100% mentioned that Danielle struggles from a 2-point stance as opposed to a 3-point stance. That's fine. That's true. We know that to be true. We've seen that experiment happen before. This morning on the Power Trip, Lieber was basically saying to this report, answering this exact report or commenting on this exact report, saying that whether you go 3-4 or whether you go regular, Danielle Hunter is a better option, right? He just is a better option. It's the kind of guy you don't want to lose there. So you have that opportunity there to get him, whether it's 3-4 or whether it's 4-3, and if they do sprinkle in both, maybe that is the benefit to keep him. So that's not an argument necessarily to say, hey, it's not worth getting rid of the cap space. It's not, or clearing the cap space. It's not worth getting those 2 picks. Those are still viable options there, but just a little ebb and flow and a little different thought maybe at this point in time, knowing that what we know now as opposed to what we knew a month ago, 2 months ago, or during the last season when it comes to Danielle Hunter and his strengths and attributes. Now, Jack, the last name we're going to bring up is a fan favorite. The last name we're going to bring up, this report is even just saying cut him outright, not even trade him. I think there's some trade value there. It might be a little difficult given contract situations, given age. But one of the names that they mentioned to clear some cap space, and they being, what was this? They being Bleacher Report. Bleacher Report was the source for this one, suggesting that the Minnesota Vikings cut safety Harrison Smith, saving $11.5 million with his roster cut. The actual quote, I'm going to read it real quick. As with many teams in this piece, the Vikings have significant work to do where their salary cap is concerned. The team is just over $16 million in the red right now. Releasing Smith and designating him post-June 1st cut would get the team about 2/3 of the way there. Smith is signed all the way through 2025, but given his age, the odds that he's never going to sniff the end of that deal are remote. If given the choice, the Vikings would no doubt prefer to clear cap space by restructuring the contracts of players like quarterback Kirk Cousins, edge rusher Danielle Hunter, both names we just mentioned. Both players carry a 2022 cap number north of $25 million, but if it reaches the point where heads have to roll, the team is much more likely to part ways with a safety nearing the end of the line than an elite pass rushing talent or a starting quarterback. Harrison Smith, your thoughts?
Yeah, that's interesting because Kevin O'Connell, Harrison Smith was the first name on the defensive side of the ball that he brought up last week, and just having a playmaker as versatile as Harrison Smith, where he can, and Ed Donatel actually talked about it in his presser today, having players where they can disguise the defense, where he can play down in the box, and he can be a single high safety as well. Harrison Smith has made a living off of being that type of player. And if you straight up cut him, I understand it because the money is going to be kind of problematic moving forward. And I think when the contract extension happened, it was a little weird. I think it was 3 or 4 years, and I think he's 33 years old already. So he's no spring chicken anymore by any means. So I don't know if I love the idea of just straight up cutting him, because then that means that Cam Bynum and Josh Metellus are the 2 starting safeties for this team. And I know there's some excitement rolling into next season from the 2 games we saw out of Cam Bynum. But other than that, there's not a whole lot there. Xavier Woods was solid, but he was another one of those guys that was just on a 1-year deal to try and win now in the Mike Zimmer era. So I don't think cutting Harrison Smith, a vocal leader on this defense, would do wonders for this team by any means. But again, if the new GM and new head coach get together and they say, you know what, this is heading towards more of a rebuild, maybe they do just cut him and they let Harrison Smith decide where he wants to play the remainder of his career. Because you get that with some of these guys where they've proven themselves for long enough, especially where they've stuck it out with one team for their entire career. I know people aren't going to want to hear this, but if they do go in the direction of a rebuild, I don't think that would really shock me at all.
Stephen on the YouTube chat actually brings up a good point, that the possibility to restructure Smith, that's there. You then have to talk about what are his values. Does he want to stay in Minnesota? Is that important to him? I think he said that before, that it's important to him, to finish his career with one team, with the Minnesota Vikings. So how much of a discount does he take to do that? You clear 11.25, I think was the number, if you cut him off the books. What can you get that number down to make it a little more serviceable? Again, this isn't the only move that the Vikings have to make. I mean, they have to make these moves to get under the cap. But it is an option to maybe keep him and, like we mentioned, get that number down and do some good things. So there's some other things to be done. Jack, this is the fun part of the offseason. You're doing mock drafts. People are speculating online, going crazy with potential trades and potential cuts. We're going to tie a bow on the podcast right there, actually, because we've kind of been taking the comments and questions throughout the show today. I know it's been a busy week as far as work stuff goes for both of us, and not necessarily a busy week for news. So just the speculation comments there. And we'll continue this conversation probably, and with a little bit different twist, maybe a special guest next week. Jack, I haven't even talked to you about that yet, but maybe a special guest next week on the podcast episode for the State of Purple podcast. You can find old episodes of the State of Purple podcast on iHeartRadio, iTunes, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts, to find all of Jack's speculation and what he did in his mock draft 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, 5.0, and 11.0. Is that where we're at?
It's a lot. Writing wise, I haven't gotten one up there yet, but the amount that I've actually done so far, that's a number I don't want to admit.
Yeah, no doubt there. Well, Jack, I appreciate the time. You have a good day. Thanks, everybody who joined us in the chat today, and everybody who subscribes to the State of Purple podcast. Again, we'll be back next week for another episode of the State of Purple podcast.
10 seconds to go. We need a Minneapolis miracle. Case on a deep drop. Steps up in the pocket. He'll fire to the right side.